As Maryland's Attorney General and longtime state senator and delegate, Brian Frosh has served and continues to serve the Maryland people as a respected and accomplished leader. All of this you've done with integrity and humility. So we're so honored at Our Maryland to have you help us mark our 5th anniversary with this special podcast interview. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Tracy, and thanks for the kind words.
Yes.
Thought you were harder to fool.
We do have a few questions that we're going to go through, and hopefully our listeners are familiar with you. But if not, if you could just tell them a little bit about yourself, your family, and why you decided to devote your entire professional career to public service.
Well, Tracy, the story that I usually tell stems from my father's work, really. Stems from my father, period. My dad was the son of immigrants. He worked his way through college and law school and ended up in Washington, D.C. after he served in the armed forces in World War II. And in the early 50s, he was a solo practitioner in Washington, D.C. He got a call from a guy who needed an attorney, and he needed an attorney pro bono. He had received a subpoena from the Senate Special or Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and that was the McCarthy Committee. This guy was a bookbinder in the government printing office. He did not have a high-level job, but McCarthy accused him of being a communist. And my dad agreed to represent him before the McCarthy Committee. And when he did, he got a summons from Roy Cohn to go down to Capitol Hill. And Cohn said to my dad, "Look, your client's in a lot of trouble. If you represent him, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And my advice to you is get rid of him as fast as you can." My dad declined to follow that advice. He sat next to him when he testified before the McCarthy Committee. And immediately after the hearing, McCarthy denounced him as a communist and denounced the client as a communist. He lost his job as a bookbinder as a result of those charges, and he disappeared. My dad was undeterred, and in 1958, he ran for county council in Montgomery County, and one of his passions was civil rights, and he was one of the prime movers behind Montgomery County's first public accommodations ordinance. And they were successful in getting it passed. I think it was the first in the state as well. And when my dad stood for re-election in 1962, my sister, who I think was 10 years old at the time, tells the story of being with him at a campaign event when a rather large person came up to him and poked my dad in the chest and said, "I wouldn't vote for you if you were the last guy on earth." And I have to clean this next part up a little bit. He said, "You are an African-American loving Jew." And, his analysis was correct. I'm pretty sure my dad didn't get his vote. And in fact, he and everybody else who supported that public accommodations ordinance were swept out of office. It was a very nasty year. And it's his example that I guess ignited a passion in me for public service. And I'm a total recidivist. I've been at it for 36 years. And but I've done my last campaign.
So before you're gone, let's talk a little bit about what you've been able to do. Unfortunately, today, as we speak, the nation is still processing the most recent mass killings, including in Buffalo, New York, where African Americans were targeted, as well as the children and teachers in Uvalde, Texas. And I believe this morning, Tulsa as well, there's been another shooting at a healthcare center. I know that this was an issue that you focused on for years, that being gun control. Would you share your thoughts and tell us what actions you've taken to try to prevent this in Maryland, as well as any suggestions on how we can all process this and perhaps get some change.
Yeah. Well, this has been one of the issues that I started working on as soon as I was in elective office and have continued ever since. Uh, I fought to get legislation passed to ban Saturday night specials when I was first elected to the House of Delegates in 1986. And we were successful in that. And in 2013, after the murders in Newtown, Connecticut, of 20 school children and 6 of their teachers, I put together a comprehensive bill, which we called the Firearm Safety Act of 2013. And Governor O'Malley and Jamie Raskin and I put the bill together. I was the Senate floor leader and sponsor, and it did a number of best practices across the country. It banned assault weapons in Maryland. It required a license and deep background checks in order for somebody to have a handgun qualification license to be able to buy or own a handgun. And there were a number of other best practices that were incorporated in that, but those two were perhaps the most important. As soon as I was elected Attorney General, as soon as I was sworn in, I was put in the place of having to defend those laws, and most especially the assault weapons ban. And we were successful. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, en banc, that means the entire Federal Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, wrote an opinion saying, look, these weapons are not protected by the Second Amendment. They're weapons of war, not covered by the Second Amendment. That decision is now back up in the Supreme Court. I mean, we've had our law upheld a number of different times, and also our handgun qualification license and our right to concealed carry restrictions have all been upheld by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. But they're now being revisited by this new Trump majority Supreme Court. And in my view, the most egregiously wrongly decided case in many years, perhaps, we'll see something worse in the next few weeks, but the Heller decision by the Supreme Court, which said that the District of Columbia did not have the right to restrict weapons to a home. The District of Columbia had very strong regulations against handgun possession. The Supreme Court said, no, the Second Amendment protects individuals, their right to own and possess and use firearms. That's not what the Second Amendment says, but that's what the Supreme Court says it says, so that's the law. And we face a very unsympathetic Supreme Court in the challenges that we're seeing to Maryland's laws. And even Heller said that reasonable state restrictions on the possession and ownership of weapons is constitutional. Not clear what this batch is going to do. And you asked me, and I apologize, what can we do? Well, my office is going to fight like hell to keep our law in place and to have it upheld by the Supreme Court. If they swat it down, I'm not sure what we'll be able to do. We will craft solutions that go around their decision and protect Marylanders. But it depends on how far they go. And it's a really, really difficult situation at the moment. You don't have to recite all the different mass shootings to make clear how dangerous it is to have weapons out on the street, as the United States has 400 million or so weapons in private hands. No other country in the world has this kind of problem with guns and gun violence, gun deaths. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that Maryland laws stay in force, intact, and protect our folks.
We know that you've done a lot of work to protect Marylanders, and we also know that in politics, sometimes it can be difficult to make an impact. Of course, one of the best ways to show the critical role that government plays in our lives is to lead by example. So, if you could you point to 3 examples of issues where you've led, either as Attorney General or in the General Assembly, something that's led to making a difference in the lives of Marylanders?
Putting aside guns, I'll talk about a couple other things. It's a difficult question to answer because it's like saying, which are your favorite children? But let me point out a couple of things that I think have been impactful. One was Maryland had a policy that said, if you don't pay a ticket that you get for driving, we're going to suspend your driver's license. And what it meant was that for $75 or $100 or some relatively small amount, people would lose their driver's licenses because they were poor. And they had to decide, am I going to pay the rent this month, or am I going to pay the MVA? Or am I going to put food on the table or pay a medical bill or send $75 to the Motor Vehicle Administration? And what it did was pound people deeper into poverty, because if you can't get a car, you can't work, you can't get your kids to school, you can't get to medical appointments. So our office sponsored legislation to just eliminate that policy, put Maryland back in the same shoes as any other creditor. We can go sue people for their debts, but we're not going to take away their livelihood by suspending their driver's license. And of course, if you drive on a suspended license, as many people have to do, you can go to jail. You get caught driving on a suspended license, you can literally end up in jail. The bill that we sponsored was passed, and 130,000 some Marylanders had their driver's licenses reinstated the day that law went into effect. So it's also, there were tens of thousands each year who were losing their licenses or having them suspended. That has not happened since 2020. And I think that's had a huge and salutary impact on Marylanders and on our society. Another one that has a narrower benefit, but I think extremely important, was bail reform. This is something I tried to do as a legislator and was not successful. But when I became Attorney General, I sought a rule change from our Court of Appeals. That's our highest court. And the problem was that we had thousands of people in our jails for one simple reason: they were poor. They had committed minor crimes in most cases, urinating in public, trespassing, things like that. And a judge would set bail of $250, or you could bond your way out for $250 or $150. But as I said a few minutes ago, lots of folks don't have that kind of money. So they sit in jail oftentimes for weeks and months before their trial. And it's unjust, it's unfair, it's not good for the legal system. We got the Court of Appeals to pass a rule to say that no judge shall set cash bail unless they determine that somebody can meet that bail. They can meet the financial conditions of their release. And money bail is at the lowest of the options for judges to use. If somebody's dangerous, lock them up. If somebody is going to show up for trial and doesn't pose a threat to society, figure out a way to monitor him or her when they're out and pending trial. And it's been very successful. Thousands fewer people in jail each year, The only problem is, I would say it hasn't gone far enough. Judges have broad discretion. Too many of them lock people up when they shouldn't. Too many of them still use money bail. But overall, it's made a big difference. We're saving money because folks are not sitting behind bars waiting for trial. I'll tell you, I'm tempted to tell a story, but I think it'll take too long. We found there was a nursing home chain, the NMS nursing homes, and they had folks who were in their facilities on Medicaid reimbursement. Medicaid reimbursement is about half of what Medicare reimbursement is, $250 a day as opposed to $500 a day. And NMS, when they found somebody who was Medicare eligible, would when they found somebody who was Medicare eligible, they would throw out a person who was on Medicaid, and they literally dumped them in homeless shelters, unlicensed assisted living facilities. We found one instance in which they took a woman suffering from severe dementia, dropped her at her son's house, and her son came home to find her wandering around the neighborhood. It was very clear that they were violating the law, because you're not allowed to throw someone out because they're on Medicaid. We not only stopped those practices, we socked them with a fine of over $2 million. They stopped doing business in our state, and we used that as the basis for a reform in the General Assembly to protect people from that kind of treatment in the future by anyone. And I think it's an extremely important series of reforms to help the most vulnerable people in our society, folks who can't take care of themselves, who are extremely sick and extremely vulnerable.
And along with that, with the pandemic, we've really seen some of the cracks in our system, especially around issues of housing. As you know, we're facing an eviction crisis, and as you have protected Marylanders in the past, are there any efforts to continue to protect them against these unwarranted evictions?
Yeah, it's a very important issue. When the COVID crisis started, we put together an Access to Justice task force. We got experts from all over the state, judges, lawyers, doctors, business people, to try to see what we could do to make sure that people didn't lose their homes, didn't lose their livelihood because of the COVID restrictions, the COVID challenges. And one of the things we found, this was really a surprise to me. I knew that the law in Maryland is very favorable to landlords and very unfavorable to tenants. But I did not know that we had one of the highest eviction filing rates in the country. What I mean is there are 92.5 eviction filings for each 100 units in the state of Maryland. That doesn't mean that 92.5% of tenants get eviction lawsuits filed against them in any given year. What it means is that some landlords file suit against their tenants every single month. You have to pay by the 5th. And if you don't pay by the 5th, the landlord, many of them, file for eviction on the 6th. And one of the reasons that we have that is because we have among the lowest eviction filing fees in the country. It costs you $15, $15, in order to throw someone out of their home. And we tried to address that head on. We said that we should raise the eviction filing fees to the national average, which is between $115 and $120, and prohibit the landlords from collecting that money from the tenants, because right now they're using our courts as a collection system. They're not using it to throw people out. They haul them into court. They charge them extra fees for that. they charge them attorney's fees and filing fees and a bunch of other fees. And of course, they have to pay a late fee on top of it. It increases the rent to many tenants by 10, 20%. And we, we, we sponsored legislation for the past two sessions that tried to put us in the same place that most other states are, with a reasonable eviction filing fee. We wanted to use the money to provide counsel for tenants in court, because we know how important that is. It changes the outcome. In 80 to 90% of the cases, tenants do much, much better. We have not been successful in those efforts. That remains unaddressed. But in the process, we were able to do several other things that I think were very helpful to tenants. Legislation was passed requiring landlords to give tenants 10 days notice before they file an eviction lawsuit. So it'll give them more time. First of all, it lets them know before they get a lawsuit that landlords getting ready. And by the way, this legislation was sponsored by Delegate Regina Boyce in Baltimore City. And I think it may be the most significant thing that the General Assembly has done for tenants in a number of years. The second thing, and this is also extremely significant, second thing is General Assembly found different pots of money. We were able to give $8.7 million to Maryland Legal Services at the height of the crisis in 2020, to keep legal services for poor people running during the pandemic. But their source of income is dependent upon court filing fees. Courts were closed, so no filing fees, and interest on lawyers' trust accounts, which were zero because banks weren't paying significant interest on anybody's accounts. So that money got them through 2020. And then starting in 2021, 2022, the General Assembly added additional sources of funds for the Maryland Legal Services Corporation. And it now is over $14 million a year of additional money that will be used to help tenants avoid losing their homes. And I think that's extremely important.
It's good to hear that there may be some things that can be done. So let me pivot just a little bit. We know that what the federal government does affects everyone in the nation, but particularly given our proximity to DC, given Maryland's proximity to DC, and the amount of federal workers that reside in Maryland.
Right.
Some of our state officials, including our governor, have said that what happens in Washington doesn't really affect us. It's not our concern. Early on in your tenure, as well as Governor Hogan's term, there was a matter with the AG's authority to take on some extremely harmful actions that were perpetrated by the Trump administration. Government Hogan sought to withhold funds for these efforts. Can you tell us what happened and what are some of the actions that you took to protect Maryland consumers in this regard?
Yeah, well, to start at the beginning, the Maryland Attorney General doesn't have what are called common law powers, which means that unlike elected attorneys general all around the nation, I cannot sue just to protect the welfare of Marylanders. I either have to get permission from the governor or I have to get the General Assembly to pass a law. So when Trump was sworn in the first week, he issued his first Muslim ban executive order. And I wrote to Governor Hogan and I said, look, this is unconstitutional. It's a terrible policy. It's unconstitutional. Give me the authority to sue Trump. He didn't respond. So I went to the General Assembly and I said, look, would you pass a law to give me this authority, not just for the Muslim ban, but if this guy does any other crazy stuff? And they passed a law that gave the Maryland Attorney General the authority to protect the welfare of Marylanders when it was threatened by federal action or inaction. As a result, we had, 75 to 100 lawsuits that we filed over the course of the Trump administration. And each one of them was important to the welfare of Marylanders. And of course, the Muslim ban, uh, was critically important. We were in court challenging the second iteration of the Muslim ban. Um, but in addition to civil rights, the Trump administration tried to obstruct women's rights to contraceptive care, to all sorts of other kinds of health care, and including reproductive health care, and tried to undermine the Affordable Care Act, upon which hundreds of thousands of Marylanders rely for their insurance, and many others rely upon for reduction in costs for their insurance. And we were able, along with other attorneys general around the country, to stymie those extraordinarily ill-advised policies. We fought back against what I think was the cruelest U.S. policy I've seen in my lifetime, and that was the idea that we would take people's children away when they crossed the border. We would separate families and we would hold their kids hostage. And it was very clear, it was from what the administration said, it wasn't because of national security. It wasn't because of public safety. They took people's children away because they thought it would deter them from stepping across that boundary. And while they did it, they forgot to identify the kids and match them up somehow with their parents so they could reunite them. They didn't care. And at the end of the Trump administration, there were still many kids who were unable to identify their parents because some of them were infants, some of them were toddlers. Even the 4, 5, 6-year-olds often didn't know how to identify their parents other than mommy and daddy, or Jose, or Brian, or whatever. And I think I think that was such a inhumane, irrational, and ultimately damaging policy, not just to the people whose families were broken apart, some forever, but to all of us as Americans. It really destroys the fabric of society when the government engages in that kind of cruelty. And there were dozens of other cases. We were the lead state in stopping the Trump administration from starting to drill for oil off the East Coast, and they were going to expand it in the West Coast and in the Arctic. And we were able to tie them up and tie them down. They ultimately abandoned that reckless, dangerous plan. Drilling would have been open at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, which would have been catastrophic to the health of the bay, and dozens of other environmental cases where they wanted to cut back on emissions from cars and trucks and industries and landfills. And, people die from that stuff. So the stuff that the Trump administration proposed that we fought back on and won was extraordinarily important to Marylanders.
Thanks for sharing that example. As we know, today's political environment has certainly become more contentious, to say the least. And there are so many politicians and purveyors of disinformation that are spreading hate. And they're doing it for political gain.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, some public officials and leaders in Maryland participated in the events of January 6th that led to the insurrection on the Capitol. Some of these officials continue to be involved in efforts to subvert future Democratic elections. Does the Attorney General have any jurisdiction in this area? And what are your thoughts on how to counter this?
Well, one of the things that we can do is to use the bully pulpit of the Office of the Attorney General to push back. And I mean, when I was in the General Assembly, and I was only there 28 years, but when I was in the General Assembly, people didn't lie, especially didn't stand up on the Senate floor or the House floor and just tell a bald-faced lie. The culture has changed dramatically since Donald Trump ran for president. And if people are perjuring themselves in Maryland, if they're standing up in court, if they're under oath and they lie, they can be prosecuted. But a lot of the acts, the most dangerous acts that we've seen, the insurrection on January 6th, they take place in Washington, D.C. And or that took place in Washington, D.C. And the other lies and inflammatory and hateful comments don't come so much from our state. Some of them are coming from Maryland. And the Attorney General and all the local prosecutors can prosecute hate crimes. Thankfully, we haven't seen that many violent hate crimes in our state. We've heard a lot of hate speech, a lot more hate speech than we've heard in previous years, so much that my office, after the November 2016 election, had to open a hate crimes hotline so that people could report hate speech and hate crimes to us. But the violent crimes, people are painting swastikas on synagogues and defacing churches and doing all kinds of horrible stuff. And those crimes get prosecuted, usually at the local level. And thankfully, we've not had shootings like those in Buffalo or elsewhere that seem to be racially or ethnically motivated. But we do have the ability to prosecute those kinds of actions, and would certainly engage if we found that happening in Maryland.
So you are not running for re-election as Attorney General in this year's elections. Can you describe what you see as the most important skills or attributes that should be prioritized in your successor?
Well, I think among the most important skills for somebody in any public office, but especially Attorney General, is the willingness and the ability to listen. There are two sides to every single story, every single case, and we handle hundreds of thousands of cases. So you got to be able, in order to make intelligent decisions, and in order to allow people to be heard, and in order to have due process, you got to listen. And I think that's essential for anybody who wants to be Attorney General. Another important skill is the ability to say no. I get calls all the time from my friends saying, "This just happened. Will you go out and do X, Y, and Z? Or give me an advice about whether I can do X or Y." And I have to say, sorry, that's not going to work. We can help you solve a problem, but the way you're going about it is illegal or wrong, or we'll lose. And so you have to be able to look people in the eye, both your friends and people who aren't necessarily your friends, and say, no, we're not doing that. Those are extremely important skills. It's also, if you want to be Attorney General, it's essential. The Constitution requires that you be an attorney for 10 years. And the more experience that folks have as practicing attorneys, the better. It's also useful to have a broad understanding of state government. And people talk about term limits all the time. I have to say, I was a better legislator and a better Attorney General each day. I learn something every day I'm in office. And I may not apply it for 5 years or 10 years, but I may apply it tomorrow or next week. But it's a continuing process of learning. And so I think people with experience and people with the willingness to listen and learn make the best public officials and attorneys general.
I think you might have answered a little bit of my next question. Similarly, we're looking for a new governor in Maryland. What sort of things would you like to see in the next governor?
A lot of the same things. I mean, somebody who's willing to listen, somebody who's tough enough to say no, even if it's a popular issue or uh, a good friend. I mean, we have so much performance in politics these days. I mean, you know, the governor wrote a letter to the mayor of Baltimore City the other day or last week saying, you got to crack down on crime in Baltimore City. Well, everybody knows that we got a problem with crime. The governor has as much ability and certainly more resources than the mayor of Baltimore. Uh, and people pointing fingers at each other doesn't really help. We need somebody who's going to look at a problem and address it and not look to somebody else and say, hey, this is your problem, this is your fault. Stand up, do the job, and yeah, maybe you won't get as much media attention as if you were trying to fob it off on somebody else or blame somebody else. But it's the only way that we move forward in terms of public policy.
Well, hopefully, we're lucky enough to have someone like you take your place. So,
We have two
a
very
little
good
bit,
candidates for Attorney General.
yeah, great. I won't ask for who you're endorsing here, but um, our Maryland, we were launched in 2017, and again, thank you for joining us for our 5-year anniversary. We're the largest state online platform for promoting a just and sustainable future for all Marylanders. Of course, we work across issues, constituencies, and in the state, we basically just try to get Marylanders to understand more about their impact and what they can do to engage in public policy, um, and really hold their public officials accountable. Given your years as Attorney General and as a senior legislator, what advice would you give to our followers on how they can be active and engaged and ensure a responsive government?
Well, let me congratulate our Maryland on the excellent work that you all have done for the past 5 years. Larry Ottinger is a longtime friend and a very capable person, and I've been impressed with the work that you guys have done. It's essential to have people speak out and organize around issues that are important to all of us. And our Maryland does that, does it very well. And I think it's really important for every single one of us to pay attention to what's going on and to be active in terms of seeking solutions. And if, that doesn't mean that you have to go door to door and help people or even contribute money, but both those things are useful and welcome, I'm sure, for the folks who are championing good causes. What is absolutely essential, and every person's right, but also their duty, and that is to vote. I mean, we've seen the harm that can be done when demagogues get elected to high office, and elections do have consequences. And even when we're not talking about good versus evil, there are differences between candidates, differences between philosophies. And it's important for every single Marylander, every single American to be engaged in the political process and to vote and to make their views known and bring them to reality. I mean, we have dislocations that are just uh, they're a fact of life in the United States as a result of our Constitution. We have an overwhelming majority of Americans and Marylanders who think that reasonable gun safety measures are appropriate. And we can show scientifically, in fact, that they are, that it will save lives. And despite that fact, you have a small minority who manage to thwart any real progress on that issue. Same is true with women's reproductive care. If if the state gets engaged, most people agree that women ought to have the ability to make their own reproductive decisions, certainly up to a point. And it looks like we're heading in the opposite direction. And that only happens, well, it happens for two reasons: because people don't participate in the public discourse and elections, and also because of Maryland's constitutional quirks. We have a small minority that is overrepresented in the United States Senate, in the House of Representatives, and on the Supreme Court. And the only way to make progress is for every single one of us to go out and vote.
That's certainly good advice and a good reminder ahead of our upcoming elections. Lastly, some say that you have a hidden and underappreciated talent for your sense of humor as well as telling a story. So I was hoping that you could leave us with one of your stories.
I object to the question because, it suggests that I'm not funny. That I think I'm funny, but nobody appreciates it. But I will tell you a story anyway, Tracy.
Great.
And I was in my office in the Maryland Senate in Annapolis one afternoon. I had an appointment with somebody. I think it was around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And he was coming in from out of town. And I got a phone call from him, and he said, look, I'm really sorry I'm late. It was already 20 past the hour. I said, I'm sorry I'm late. I'm going to be even later. I'm on the Beltway. Traffic is just awful. And I said, don't worry about it. I'm not going anywhere. Take your time. But be careful, because there are reports of somebody going the wrong way around the Beltway. And he said, one guy, there are hundreds of them. And, that's maybe a good metaphor for my career in public service. I'm going one way, and hundreds of people are headed the opposite direction. Maybe I'm headed the right direction now, since I'm not seeking re-election. I don't know.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And again, thank you so much for joining us and helping us to celebrate our 5-year anniversary. We're really honored to have spoken to you, and I'm sure many Marylanders would thank you for all of the great work that you've done.
Well, thank you, Tracy. Thank you for the great work that our Maryland and you are doing. I appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity to join you.